Thank you, Jeff. I'm just going to apologize up front. I got a little bit of a cold or something going on, so if I cough, I'll try and turn away from the microphone so don't scare you all. All right, so the purpose of my talk today is just to provide an overview of the CSMI process and schedule. We've heard quite a bit over the last 2 days on some of the good work that's occurring in the Upper Lakes with respect to CSMI. I'll touch upon some of that work later in the presentation, but this is really going to be a data-free presentation. It's mostly going to be on process. So hopefully that's something that's a continued effort. Again, disclaimer. All right, so the purpose of my talk today is to provide an overview of the 5-year CSMI process. This is going to be from the Annex 10 perspective. For those that aren't aware, Annex 10 is from the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. It's the science annex to the agreement between the U.S. and Canada. And it's in that annex where we commit ourselves to implementing the CSMI approach. And you'll see later on in the presentation where this is an Annex 10 perspective as opposed to a broad agreement-wide perspective. And then at the end of the presentation, I'll just briefly touch upon some of the CSMI activities that have occurred since 2014, going up through 2018 in Lake Ontario. So first, a little bit of background. So CSMI actually started in 2002. I remember that we had a meeting in Bob Richardson's house up in Burlington, Canada. This is really just an opportunity for EPA and Environment Canada at that time to figure out how we can better leverage our ships, our programs, and work more cooperatively to monitor the Great Lakes. At this time, it was just called the Cooperative Monitoring Initiative back in 2003 when we focused in on Lake Ontario. From there, we followed the current cycle we have going to Erie, Michigan, etc. Based on the success of that, in 2006, we started working with other federal agencies and other partners and included more science-based priorities. It wasn't just focused on monitoring. So here's the genesis for CSMI, roughly about 10 years ago or so. So a few years later, this process was formalized through the Binational Executive Committee. So for folks that have been dealing with Great Lakes issues for a while, that's the predecessor to the current Great Lakes Executive Committee, which oversees the implementation of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. At that time, when CSMI was formalized, the upstream connecting channels were also added to that lake in 2009. So in the current agreement, so the agreement was amended in 2012, it very specifically calls out CSMI. So it requires the parties to implement a cooperative science and monitoring initiative for each of the Great Lakes in a 5-year rotational basis, where we focus on monitoring activities and other science priorities identified through the lake-wide management process. And it's up to the work under this annex to coordinate these activities across governments and other non-government organizations. So the current approach that we have for CSMI builds heavily on the previous work that was done over the last 10 years. So it's a binational effort to provide lake managers, and I added fishery managers here as well, because when you look at the lake partnership priorities over the years, a lot of them are driven by trying to better understand impacts of the lower food web and those impacts on the broader fishery in each of those given lakes. So we will provide those managers with the science and monitoring information necessary for them to make management decisions. It's important to note that this CSMI process does not set the priorities. Instead, those priorities are identified through the lake partnerships. And it's up to the CSMI group to develop the plans and approaches for how to address those priorities. And again, it follows a 5-year rotational cycle where we cycle through priority setting, planning, field year, analysis, and reporting. It's a very colorful slide, but this is just trying to illustrate what that 5-year cycle is. So if you look here in 2017, even though the field year, we're heavily focused right now in Lake Huron, work is ongoing in each of the 5 lakes with respect to the CSMI process, whether we're analyzing Lake Superior data, reporting out on Lake Michigan data, beginning our planning efforts for Lake Ontario, and doing priority setting for Lake. So this is perhaps an easier way and less challenging on the eyes to look at what's going on in 2017. So taking that vertical look at that previous table, right now we're in the process of ramping up for our intensive field campaign in Lake Huron. We are doing data analysis from the 2016 field year in Lake Superior. We heard about quite a bit of that yesterday. We are beginning the process of reporting out for Lake Michigan. We're identifying priorities for Lake Erie. I believe there's a Lake Erie planning or prioritization workshop planned for sometime this fall. And we're beginning the planning process for Lake Ontario, building off a prioritization CSMI workshop that was held in the Cornell Field Station back in November of last year. So instead of taking that vertical slice of the matrix, if we looked at just one lake and took the sort of diagonal process of it, so let's take Lake Huron. So the planning for Lake Huron should have occurred in 2016. I know in working with many of you here in the crowd, we were a bit delayed this year with just some turnover and changes in management and all sorts of stuff, but hopefully we'll have everything in place to have a successful 2017 field campaign. So if we take that process, we get priorities from the Lake Partnership. They get submitted officially to Annex 10. So the co-chairs of Annex 10 are myself and Randy Urbandi from Environment and Climate Change Canada. And it's up to a CSMI task team then to clarify those priorities as appropriate, to explore how existing base programs can address those priorities. It's important to note that CSMI is not just funding new work, but in many instances, a lake priority could be addressed through ongoing crayfish monitoring by USGS, or the ongoing fish contaminant monitoring program by EPA, or some other ongoing program by any other agency. And then we also want to figure out how we can leverage and really work together and coordinate to accomplish the work to address those priorities. And then where possible and where funding exists, identify new projects that can't be, to address priorities that can't be addressed through either leveraging, cooperating, or through base programs. Then we do our field year. We follow that up with the year roughly of analysis, do some preliminary reporting at IAGLR. So at IAGLR this year, we will have a Lake Superior session at the Detroit conference, providing an opportunity for some of the PIs to present during a Lake Superior session. I would say this is probably the most important aspect where we can probably do better. And that's reporting for CSMI. I think we've done a lot of great work over the last 10 years or so on doing science programs, getting the information out in publications, but from a sort of synthesis and integrated fashion. I think that there's some great opportunities here where we can work better to sort of close that feedback loop. So if the lake partnerships are identifying priorities, we're trying to address those priorities through science. It's very critical that we get the information back to them so they can make management actions and decisions and then come up with new or refined priorities as appropriate. And then we go back through the priority setting process. And there's a lot of other organizations that have sort of bought into this process. So I was talking with Matthew Child during just before this session started here, which reminded me the IJC is playing a critical role, especially in this priority setting processes, working with the lake partnerships, in holding workshops and meetings and coordinating activities to identify those priorities. Sea Grant is playing a big role in the reporting aspect, in providing some outreach on this as well. I know the Fishery Commission has changed their reporting timeframe to try and align with some of the CSMI cycles as well. So where do we stand right now? So we're still in a bit of a transition time period. There's been a lot of turnover within EPA, in particular within the Great Lakes National Program Office, and how we staff the annexes. So for a variety of different reasons, that formal structure we had under the previous agreement in 2009 had weakened some. So we needed to go through a process to sort of redevelop that infrastructure for CSMI. So as it currently stands, we have a core CSMI task team. The first step was to get federal U.S. membership on that. So we had EPA, USGS, NOAA, and Fish and Wildlife Service reps sitting on that. But there's still a lot more work to do. We need to do a much better job identifying appropriate state and tribal reps, appropriate additional Canadian reps to sit on these task teams, and to do so in an efficient manner. So maybe we identify a way of doing this where you rotate in and out depending on the topic of conversation. So we don't have someone that's focused just on Lake Ontario having to sit in on all the conversations with respect to Lake Superior, Huron, etc. All right, so I have about 8 minutes left, so I'm going to kind of burn through some of these next few slides. And the goal here is just to provide the audience here with a flavor of the activities and these are new activities that we've done through CSMI from 2014 through 2017. For 2018 in Lake Ontario, I will just list the Lake Partnership priorities. So if anyone's interested in learning more about these efforts, who the PIs are, what some of the preliminary results are, please get a hold of me and I can do the best of putting you in touch with the right people to get some results. So in Lake Erie in 2014, so again, these are just sort of the new projects that were done as part of CSMI. We looked at this sort of nearshore offshore gradient. For Lake Erie, it's not so much nearshore offshore, but it's more of a spatial component, east to central, central to west, etc. On the distribution abundance of nutrients and biota. We looked at internal phosphorus loads, in particular to the western Lake Erie Basin, and trying to develop a mass budget of phosphorus for the western basin. We did an intensive benthic study, trying to better understand the relationships between hypoxia and dry sediment abundance. And then we also did a connecting channel effort in the Huron-Erie corridor. So just briefly, trying to give a snapshot of what was done. You can see, through ship-based sampling, through diver-based sampling, covered a broad array of Lake Erie, trying to get a better handle on dry sediment abundance in Lake Erie. You can see here with some of the preliminary results, the red line shows that we had the peak of zebra mussels in the early 90s. They've roughly leveled off in the western basin. We're still seeing a general uptick in quad mussels in the western basin of Lake Erie. Another important thing to note is that we believe that hypoxia is playing a big role in limiting dry sediment growth in the central basin of Lake Erie. So I think a good management question is, we're going through the process of setting targets for reducing phosphorus inputs into Lake Erie to manage harmful algal blooms and hypoxia. So what happens when we're successful? Do we then sort of exacerbate the growth of mussels in the central basin? So for Lake Michigan, again, very similar nearshore to offshore gradient, looking at nutrients, the lower food web. I'll show a slide of those sampling locations shortly, and I think Bo may touch upon this as part of his presentation later today. If not, he's the right person to reach out to for more information. Again, we did an intensive lower food web assessment for benthos in Lake Michigan, and then we also did some contaminants work addressing some of the Lake Michigan partnership priorities. So that nearshore to offshore gradient was looking at these sort of contrasting habitats, trying to pick river mouths around Lake Michigan in sampling those at sort of seasonal, roughly from early May to maybe the September timeframe, trying to get a sense of how things are changing over time from nutrients in the lower food web. We also used a bunch of new technology like gliders, buoys, acoustics, and other towed instruments as part of that effort. And it was a broad collaboration with GS, NOAA, and EPA, along with a lot of other academics as well. So again, you'll see that benthos showed up a second time. You'll see it again as we go forward. This is a very common need that the lake partnerships have, is to provide an intensive look at what's occurring in benthos in that lake. So the goal is, hopefully going forward, we'll have these 5-year snapshots of benthic community, diacharia, dreisseniid, in each of the lakes going forward. And we used a lot of, this thing right here is called a benthic sled. We can attach a GoPro to that, and with that you get a video of what's happening in the bottom. That's all the mussels at a depth of 80 meters in Lake Michigan. You can see there's just tons of them. So we got video transects all around Lake Michigan, and we're using this to try and refine our estimates of abundance and overall biomass of mussels in Lake Michigan, and we're taking the same approach to Lake Huron this year. I think the video really shows very clearly the broad impact that the mussels are having on the lakes. So for Lake Superior, some of the new projects addressing lake partnership priorities, looking at some watershed work, again, lower food web in benthic and pelagic fish monitoring, and lake sturgeon rehabilitation programs. And we heard about these yesterday during the Superior Lake Committee session. And here's just a map, generally, of all the stations that we covered in 2015 in Lake Superior, looking at nutrients, lower food web, and benthos in Lake Superior. So for Lake Huron, we've just recently been able to finalize our suite of projects that we're planning for Lake Huron. So again, an integrative survey to assess around gobies, trying to get a better handle on the overall abundance of gobies. Again, linking fish to lower trophic level variability, a creel study, again, benthos and then doing some diet studies as well. And here's the general map of the transects that we're aiming to cover in Lake Huron. Up here in the St. Mary's, 2 up in the North Channel, 3 here in Georgian Bay. We have Saginaw Bay and Thunder Bay. And then we have 3 down here in the southern part of Lake Huron. And we're still exploring whether or not we can try and address something here in the eastern part of Lake Huron. So as I indicated, Lake Ontario, we're still working through how we can address these priorities. So here are the priorities that the Lake Ontario Partnership has transferred to Annex 10. These are very similar across a lot of the priorities that we see in the other lakes as well. So I think a key thing that we can do in Annex 10, and particularly in CSMI, look at these cross-lake synergies and lessons learned, and how we can apply lessons of either study designs or what we learned from one lake to the other. So the other next steps that we're going to work on in the next few months is finalizing our structure and process, working on establishing those feedback loops through reporting. And again, if anyone's interested in more detailed information on any of these CSMI projects, let me know, and I'll do the best I can to get information to you. So thank you.